Hello everyone, welcome to our next training video, Numbers 25. Just take a moment now to pray for your groups and for yourself as you consider and we'll be studying Numbers 25. But getting into our passage, just a reminder that in Numbers 25 verse 1 to 3 and chapters 31 verse 16, which is quite important, in Numbers 22 to 24, we saw that Balaam and Balak failed to curse God's people because of God's promises. But in Numbers 25 and as Numbers 31 verse 16 show us, Balaam had a plan B. They couldn't in any way thwart God's purposes or plans, but that doesn't mean they can't seduce Israel's hearts. And that's what they do through idolatry. And what you need to see in the story of the Bible, that idolatry is Israel's bane. And it starts actually as early as Genesis 31 verse 25 to 34, when Rachel actually takes her dad's gods, Laban's gods, with her when they flee from Laban to the promised land or to Canaan. And then similarly we see in Exodus 32 verse 1 to 6 that Israel, just after making a covenant with God, they actually emulate Rachel in that they actually then worship other gods. They ask Aaron to create gods for them, which Aaron does, and then they even claim that those gods rescued them from Egypt by the making of the golden calf. And in verse 6 we discover that it all ended in sexual revelry and basically a vile festival. And the sad part about Exodus 32, of course, is they thought they were doing this in honor of God. This is a festival to the Lord. Now in Numbers 25 verse 1 to 3 we basically see the golden calf in a type of repeat when Midian and Moab seduce Israel into the worship of Baal. This will be the first time Baal is introduced, or Israel will come in contact with Baal, Numbers 25 verse 1 to 3. And sadly, this will be Israel's bane throughout their history and their entire time in the promised land. Deuteronomy 31 verse 16 to 18, God told Moses that they will, as he says, prostitute themselves to other gods. There will be future idolatry. Joshua warns Israel to throw away the idols of your forefathers. They were just like Rachel. They kept the gods of their forefathers. And then in Judges 2 verse 11 we discover that the next generation sadly falls back into the worship of Baal. And so even though Numbers 25 verse 1 to 3 is like the bookend of the first generation, as they started in idolatry, so their last moments are ended in idolatry, showing their true heart, we see that the second generation just perpetuates this problem of idolatry. And it's a serious thing. But just on Baal, which they'll be worshipping all the way into the book of Kings, Baal is the god of rain and fertility of Canaan. And also Baal is worshipped from Canaan all the way to the Punic nations of Carthage in North Africa. And it involved the making of images, which God forbade, and sexual immorality, which God actually also forbade in the Ten Commandments, which involved wild feast and prostitution. But it was enticing because of sexual pleasure, but also the promise of prosperity. If you do these rituals, you will prosper. There will be rain and harvests, and you will be fertile. And so those powerful combinations, sexual pleasure and wealth, was almost irresistible to Israel. And so they worshipped Baal. And why would God be angry about all of this? It's because, as God said about idolatry, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. God expects covenant fidelity like a spouse in a marriage covenant. God has a special relationship with Israel. And yet Israel willingly, like an adulterer or adulteress, break that covenant by the worship of other gods. So that's the one theme. But the other big thing that comes through, of course, is atonement through propitiation. Propitiation being the absorbing and so turning away of God's wrath or righteous anger. Now, just the amazing thing about the Old Testament, of course, is you could call the entire Old Testament cross prep, because God has been giving us all sorts of pieces to the puzzle to help us understand the big picture of who Jesus is and what he came to do. One of those pieces, of course, is Genesis 3 verse 15, when God promised a serpent crusher. In Genesis 50 verse 20, we have another piece with Joseph, who was wickedly treated by his brothers, yet God turned that evil to good in the salvation of many nations through Joseph. Another piece is given later in Exodus 11 to 13 with the Passover, where Israel had to basically slaughter a lamb and use its blood to cover their doorposts. And the blood, which is a symbol of life, as Leviticus will teach us, substitutes basically for the life of the Israelites. And so the plague of death, the death of the firstborn, the just penalty of sin way back in Genesis 2 verse 17 will pass over them. Leviticus, of course, is a key book in helping us understand what Jesus will be doing in the cross through the sacrificial system, especially the Day of Atonement. But throughout Exodus to Numbers, we also see something else. Moses and Aaron interceding for the people, and so also making atonement, making sure that God is reconciled with his people. And in Numbers 21, we got another picture of Jesus with the bronze serpent. All these pieces of the puzzle. And now in Numbers 25, with Phinehas and Phinehas's actions, we are given another piece of the puzzle, namely the piece of propitiation. It's sort of touched in the Day of Atonement, but quite clearly done here in Numbers 25. And this is what Phinehas basically does. In Numbers 25 verse 4, Moses was commanded to execute, impale or hang the leaders of Israel, the representatives of Israel, and so turn away God's wrath, basically propitiate, appease God's wrath, absorb it, pay the penalty of sin, and then it'll turn away. But Moses fails to do this. And so Phinehas, who acted with God's zeal for God's glory and honor, Numbers 25 verse 11, takes a spear and actually administers the just penalty of sin, death, by impaling Zimri, who was a leader of the Israelites, a representative of the Simeonites, and Cosbi, the woman he adulterated with, in Numbers 25 verse 7 to 9. And by doing this, absorbing the penalty of sin, actually administering it, with God's zeal, God's anger is turned away. It is propitiated. And so atonement was made. And also God made a covenant of peace with Phinehas. The relationship is restored. And of course, this event in Numbers 25 points ahead to the greatest propitiation, which we'll get to just now. But in the New Testament, quite important, is that idolatry is still a serious problem and something we need to be aware of. 1 Corinthians 10, actually, the backdrop to this whole chapter is Numbers 25, or Numbers, the book of Numbers, and actually Paul zones in on Numbers 25 here, saying we should not, as a church family, commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 21 to 22, still the backdrop of Numbers, Moses tells the church that you shouldn't participate in pagan sacrifice or pagan festivals. When he says, I imply that what pagans sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake in the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Basically saying you have a covenant with God, just like Israel, the new covenant, and you can't go adulterate or break that covenant by participating in pagan worship or idolatry, sexual immorality, and pagan feasts and pleasures and revelries. But what we see in Revelation is that there were churches who did not heed the warning, and they actually fell into the snare of Numbers. Revelation 2 verse 14 to 15, Jesus actually says of the church of Pergamum, you have some that hold the teaching of Balaam, that Numbers 31 verse 16 teaching, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, so that they might eat the food sacrificed to idols and practice sexual immorality. Similarly, you tolerate the church of Thyatira, Numbers 2:21. You tolerate that woman Jezebel. She also led the people of Israel to Baal worship, who calls herself a prophetess and is teaching and seducing, just like the Moabite woman in Numbers 25 verse 1 to 3, my servants to practice sexual immorality and eat food sacrificed to idols. There we see it again. So what you see is these churches did not heed the warning. These churches continued with sexual pleasure, pursuing the things of idolatry, and they were actually caught in the web of idolatry. And so interesting, just like God burned with anger against Israel, and so 23,000 of them died in one day, we see actually the same judgment. Revelation 2 verse 16, Jesus warns, therefore repent. If you don't, I will come to you soon and wage war against them with the sword of my mouth. He will judge them. He will wage war against the church of Pergamum. Similarly, in Revelation 2 verse 22 to 23, those who actually follow this teaching, Baal worship, they will have a bed of suffering. And they will suffer intensely, and in the end, they will suffer death. And this is so that all the churches would know that He, God, searches minds and hearts, and I will give to each of you as your works deserve. Those who forsake Jesus, who fall into idol worship or think you can worship idols and God, demons and the Lord, will suffer judgment. The same warning, it's still severe. But just like Israel was rescued by propitiation, the Phinehas' propitiation, we see that our only hope of salvation is Jesus. Our only hope of escaping God's wrath and to be in a right relationship with God is Jesus. And we see a comparison between Phinehas and Jesus. Like Phinehas, who was zealous as I am for my honor among them, we see Jesus has the same zeal for his Father's glory. Zeal for your house will consume me. Jesus even points out that the reason he's come for the cross, that hour, was exactly for God's glory. Glorify your name. He was zealous for his Father's name, honor, glory. But there's a difference between Phinehas and Jesus. Whereas Phinehas drove a spear through both of them, Zimri and Cosby, and so turned away God's anger, we see that Jesus doesn't drive the spear of God's judgment through us, the sinner. But God the Father put Jesus, God the Son, forward as a propitiation by His blood to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness. Jesus drove the spear, you could say, proverbially, through Himself. He became our propitiation. He paid the debt of sin. He absorbed the penalty of sin, death. And so God's anger was turned away. Or to use the language of Galatians 3 verse 13, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. He propitiated for us. And it's quite important, what you want your folks to take away from your groups is firstly the reality and danger of idolatry. Baal worship isn't gone. And it's very important for us to see that. Idolatry, the pursuit of sexual pleasure and wealth, as with Baal worship, is alive and well in Western materialism, and we need to acknowledge it and see the reality of it and the danger. But then, of course, as Numbers 25 and as the Gospels show us, we have a desperate need of Jesus' propitiation, our absolute need for Jesus as our propitiation. He alone is the one who absorbs the penalty of sin, death, and turns away God's just wrath. It's only in Jesus, as Romans 8 verse 1 says, that there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And you want your groups to take this away, these two important points from Numbers 25. And that is Numbers 25.